6.3, number 48. Says the cosine is 4/5. And so it's a point on the unit circle. It's almost 1. So if I made the unit circle in here and did a cosine of 4/5, I got to go out here, divide this up into 4 pieces and go to 4/5. So I'm over here, so I've got to either be in the first quadrant or the fourth quadrant. And it says the angle is between 270 and 360, so I've got to be in the fourth quadrant, which means I have to go down to get to the sine, And so I'm going to use sine squared of an angle plus cosine squared of an angle is always 1. So if the cosine is 4/5, cosine squared is going to be 16/25 if I squared 4/5. And so the sine squared theta has to be, if I take 16/25 from 25/25, I get 9/25 is the sine squared. If I take the square root, the sine of theta has to be plus or minus 3/5, but since I'm down, it has to be the minus 3/5. So, all 6 trig functions, it gave us the cosine as 4/5. The sine, if it's in that fourth quadrant, has to be negative 3/5, and then the tangent would have to be negative 3/4. The reciprocal of the cosine, secant, has to be 5/4. The reciprocal of the sine, which is cosecant, would have to be negative 5/3, and the cotangent of the angle would be negative 4/3. Okay, now the sine is positive 2/3. So if I look at the unit circle, the sine is the y direction, so if I go 2/3 of the way up, I have to be on the circle, so I'm either there or there, so the cosine could either be positive or negative, but since the tangent is sine over cosine and the sine is positive, the cosine has to be negative. So we have to be over here where this side is 2/3, and we have to figure out the cosine by using sine squared theta plus cosine squared theta being 1. So 2/3 squared is 4/9 plus cosine squared theta has to be 1. 4/9 subtracted from both sides, subtracted from 1/1, which is 9/9, would be 5/9. Cosine squared would be 5/9. So the cosine of theta would be the square root of 5/9, or square root of 5/3, positive or negative, but the cosine in this quadrant would be negative. So we get negative square root of 5 over the square root of 9, which is 3. They already told us the sine of the angle was 2/3, so the tangent of the angle would be 2 over the square root of 5 and negative. The secant would be 3 over the square root of 5 and negative, and we could multiply numerator and denominator by square root of 5, and we would get negative 3 square roots of 5 over 5. And similarly for the cosecant theta, we would get 3/2. That's a simple one. And for the cotangent, we would get negative square root of 5/2 as that. And I didn't multiply square root of 5/5 to get the rationalized tangent. Good enough. Okay, now 78, a little bit tricky. So on the unit circle, It says, think about the secant of 18 degrees and the tangent of 18. Well, 18 is a pretty small angle. Now, I don't know what to think about for the sizes here on secant and tangent, but there was something about secant squared and tangent squared. And it came from the Pythagorean theorem, which was sine squared angle plus cosine squared angle always being 1. Now secant is 1 over cosine. So if I divided everything by cosine squared of the angle, what do I get? Well, sine squared of an angle over sine over cosine is tangent, so this would be tangent squared. Plus, this would be 1, cosine squared over cosine squared, and 1 over cosine squared would be the secant. If I subtract tangent squared from both sides, I get 1 is what secant squared of any angle minus tangent squared of that same angle. And that's exactly what we have. We have secant squared of some angle minus the tangent squared of that same angle. And so the answer to this is this equals 1. Now this one, we got different angles here. We have tangent and cotangent, which we know there's reciprocals of each other. This is like the tangent of 200 degrees and times a 1 over the tangent of 20 degrees. So let's take a look at where those angles are. So 200 degrees would be, here's 180, so it'd be 20 degrees below. And the tangent would be this side divided by this side. And 20 degrees would be over here and be the ratio of the sine would be, the tangent would be the sine over the cosine. Now, on those two triangles, the sines are the same size in absolute value, but one's negative and one's positive. And the cosines are the same size, but one's negative and one's positive. So the tangent would be, of this 200, would be a positive number, and it would be this, I'll call this A and B. It would be the A over B. And the cotangent would be cosine over sine, which would be B over A. And if we are to multiply those, the B's and A's cancel and we get 1. Now let's do 87. And similarly, we got to do this thinking on the unit circle. So sine over cosine would be tangent, but these are weird angles. So let's see if we can figure out what's going on here. Negative 20 degrees. So that's down a little bit on the unit circle. And the sine would be this length. So there's the sine of 20. The cosine of 380. Well, 380 would take us clear around 360 plus 20 more. Put it up here, and that would be this length is the cosine for there. Well, both of these are like, well, let's call this the A and B. And A would be a negative, and that would be a positive. So we get a negative number here. Now let's look at the tangent of 200. This was 20 above, this was 20 below. If I go 200, that would be 180 and down 20. So they seem to be focusing on this 20 degrees here thing. And the tangent would be this length to this length. They would be the same in size, except over here the sine and cosine are both negative, so this tangent number would be a positive number. Positive, if I call this A, this would be A, and this would be B, and this would be a positive A over B. And this would be an A over a B, but it would be negative because the A is negative and the B is positive. So it'd be negative A over B. So a negative A over B plus a positive A over B would be 0. Okay. Secant. When is it undefined? That's basically what they say. For what angles is f of theta undefined? In other words, secant undefined. And secant is 1 over cosine of theta. So anytime cosine is 0, it will be undefined. Well, cosine is the x-coordinate, so x is 0 at pi over 2. At not 2 pi over 2, but 3 pi over 2. And then not at 4 pi over 2, but 5 pi over 2. And 7 pi over 2. And I could go the other way, not at 0, but negative pi over 2. Negative 3 pi over 2. And so you can see that it would be undefined whenever the angle was k pi over 2, where k is an odd integer. So that's what theta can't be. So it's undefined when theta equals k number of pi over 2's, where k is an odd integer. Integer is a whole number, positive, negative, or 0. But just the odd ones. And what's the range of the cosine? Well, the cosine is the x-coordinate on the unit circle. The biggest it ever gets is 1. The smallest it ever gets is -1. So the range is from -1 to the y values or whatever to 1. So interval notation, we don't have to worry about the variable, from -1 to 1. And that's it.